welcome to the Rethink Leadership podcast with me, Jeremy Blaine. I interview leaders, experts and business professionals from around the world who are bringing leadership principles and know-how into the digitally driven 21st century workplace, with focus firmly on the how-to rather than the what. Each episode is in aid of a charity chosen by my guests, and since 2020, we've made donations to over 80 global and local causes. Today's Rethink Leadership podcast welcomes Jim Murphy. Murph is the founder and chairman of Afterburner Inc, a prominent management consultant and leadership training firm consisting of over 80 accomplished military professionals, both current and former. Having served as an F-15 fighter pilot and instructor in the US Air Force, he established Afterburner in 1996. He's also the author of 7 insightful books covering a spectrum of topics from leadership and management development to veteran career transition. He stands as a globally acknowledged thought leader in Agile continuous improvement, a pivotal aspect of Afterburner's acclaimed flawless execution methodology. Using flawless execution, Jim and his team collaborate with numerous global corporations to foster results, bridge execution gaps, and expedite their individual team and organisational performance. Afterburner's excellence has been lauded with 6 Inc. magazine's fastest growing company awards and inclusion in Forbes' magazine Small Giants list. He's been featured in Business Week, Financial Times, Newsweek, and many more, including TV media. Jim's unique insights into leadership challenges and opportunities today allow us to deep dive into this topic through this podcast, including considering how institutional leadership can inform corporate leadership in today's transformational business environment and competitive battles. Jim, thanks very much for joining me. Please introduce yourself, your journey as a pilot, military strategist, business owner, modern leadership expert. What else? Tell us more.
Well, I appreciate that introduction. I grew up on a farm in central Kentucky, so you can understand that the blueprinting that went on there. My dinner table conversations with my parents were unusual because my mom was actually the farmer. My dad was an entrepreneur and a businessman, specifically focused in sales. So we were on a horse and tobacco farm in central Kentucky, and the dinner table conversations were all about canvassing, prospecting, closing, pulling leads through the funnel, conversion rates, and then it went right from there to who's going to spread the manure in the morning. So it was an interesting way to grow up. But I was fortunate enough to be a fairly gifted athlete, and I had a chance to participate at a high-level Division I baseball. I played for the University of Kentucky on scholarship. Ended up not getting drafted to play into the pro ranks, which for me was a real bummer. And so I had to come back to my little one-horse town in Kentucky and look everybody in the eye who fully expected me to be famous and a big league player one day, and let them know that I didn't have what it takes to make it. So that was a big pivot in my life at the time. I had to go get a job, so to speak. And I went to work, luckily, for a copier and facsimile dealership, Toshiba of America, selling copiers and facsimiles. So really learned the art of selling, canvassing, demoing. It was just great for a young man. So communication skills, sales, it really elevated my EQ in a lot of ways. So that was great, but I wasn't happy. I'd expected to do something not everybody could do, and was visioning my future to be something much different than what it was. And I met a fighter pilot, and this person really inspired me to think about, I'd never even considered the military. Of course, I've already graduated from college. And then this movie Top Gun came out right after I met this gentleman. And in that movie, and for business leaders, you can attest to this, I was inspired. I was actually pulled and compelled to do the things that probably were not necessarily possible for a person like me at that time, because I saw my future in living color in great detail on that big screen. And at my age and where I was in my life, I could put myself, on that motorcycle that Maverick was driving in Top Gun. And it was so inspiring to me that, I figured out what it would take tactically to go from farm boy to fighter pilot. And literally 16 months later, I was selected to be one of the top pilots in the Air Force to go fly, at the time, the F-15, which arguably was the world's greatest fighter. And I remember climbing up the ladder, getting ready to solo the F-15 for the first time at Luke Air Force Base in Phoenix, Arizona. And I had this epiphany. I said, holy crap, how do they get a normal dude like me to go from farm boy to fighter pilot in 16 months. And I realized I went through a series of frameworks that were very simple, that created incredible high levels of mission outcome tempo, execution levels, if you will. The esprit, the camaraderie, all the other things that you think of in the military were certainly there. But what I was interested in were the performance frameworks. And I realized there was a bunch of them that I had gone through that were very purposeful, but probably frameworks the Air Force, Navy, and the Marines couldn't even articulate themselves. It was something that had happened over many, many years since World War II and through the jet age. And I realized those were powerful frameworks that if I had had those when I was an athlete or working in corporate America, not only would I have exceeded my quota, so to speak, but not only would our team, but our enterprise would have benefited from it. Because I realized I was in a fairly large enterprise. I was a small cog in that wheel, if you will. And the enterprise was the U.S. Air Force. And it was even a subset of even larger enterprise, the DoD or the U.S. government, which was highly inefficient and terrible, if you will. But here I was in this little pocket of extreme excellence. So I thought, how in the world does this happen in this overall U.S. government world? So I became fascinated with that and decided to study those as I grew up as a young fighter pilot. I became an instructor pilot, the chief of training. And so I was exposed to a lot of different things. My job was to keep 42 fighter pilots ready to deploy anywhere worldwide on a moment's notice. So that was a great role for a young man in his 20s and early 30s. But during that time frame, I was inspired to take this lightning in a bottle, this framework, this process that's known as flawless execution today, and expose it to the business world. I thought it would be a great business model. So that's how I started Afterburner, which is a management training and consulting firm. And for the last 25 plus years, we've trained over 2.5 million people in 26 countries. And a lot of people know the framework now, flawless execution, and it has inspired many other frameworks around what people consider agility or agile, this agile world. So now what I'm doing is I've transitioned into private equity, because what I've realized is some of the largest companies that you would all recognize, and even some of their famous CEOs we've worked with, and kind of in the back rooms helping them develop strategy. And I realized that our frameworks and our people, which are all former elite military professionals turned consultants, have driven billions of dollars worth of EBITDA and net worth into these corporations and companies. So, we decided, why don't we go ahead and create our own portfolio of companies and apply that to our own portfolio. So that's what I'm doing now. I'm the managing partner, CEO of Afterburner Capital.
Wow. So from farm boy to fighter pilot and beyond, no doubt as well. And lots to resonate there for the audience listening in here about extreme excellence, mission outcome, mission command, mission performance, driving that flawless execution, and this rounded career. I just want to go back to one point about that baseball experience they had so young as well, because we talk a little bit about failing fast, failing forward, and often that was a big hit at that age. But how did that give you the resilience to sort of get yourself back up and think, right, I'm going forward a different person here?
Well, I, like many of your listeners that have done anything great in their lives, they probably felt like there was no other choice. And for me, there was absolutely no other choice. I knew that I didn't want to stay in Shelby County, Kentucky for the rest of my life. I knew, I didn't want to be a copier salesperson. Not that that's a bad thing, but that's just not what had aligned to my vision growing up. And I knew there was a type of environment or culture that I wanted to be around, an ethos or performance. As an athlete, you can imagine that's where I belong, where things were fundamentally sound, and we were working every day because we were never satisfied with our current state. And if you think about what we teach at Afterburner, flawless execution is not about perfect execution. That's not possible, but it's everybody owning an impeccable accountability to executing every single day as flawless as they can. So, I knew I wanted to be around those type of environments.
Yeah, it's pretty clear when we hear you talk about, and the passion that you talk about that from. And before we get into some more of the detail, I'm quite interested to understand from your perspective the biggest differences between, if we're talking about leadership in the forces, let's say, and leadership in the business world where you are now.
Well, I mean, I think there are a ton of similarities, and I think there's strength in command and control military leadership, but also weaknesses. And I think the same is true in business. I think a lot of it depends on the environment that we're operating in, because certainly command and control, as you move up the chain of command and get removed from the battle space, the ops tempo changes. So the same is in business. That's why a lot of businesses say, hey, we have a flat hierarchy. So it really depends, I think, on the environment itself. I think it's unfair to maybe say, hey, this is the military hierarchical leadership, command and control, and this is business, and they're black and white. They're not. They're very gray. And even in the military, a lot depends on the mission itself. So if you look at the way a special operations, like a Navy SEAL team operates, or the way a fighter squadron and a fighter pilot operates, they're at the absolute tip of the spear of the mission. They're in a very complex, rapidly changing environment. So the way that they lead and the way that they execute requires a very fast execution rhythm. So if you think about failing fast, we have to fail fast, debrief, get a lesson learned, roll it right back into the plan, be agile, adjust, and execute, because we are really executing at the leading edge of change. And one thing that I've learned over the years is you can't predict the future, but you can certainly design the one that you want. So it's important that those teams, although they're executing in these complex, chaotic situations, they're still moving towards a North Star. They're still moving towards a future-based plan.
It's interesting. I had a podcast a couple of seasons ago with a commander from the British Army, and he talked about mission command being sort of 30% directive. So my view was probably more like what you just said there. There was a little bit more command and control, but he said no, actually it was about 30% directive, but then the execution was down to the small squads on the ground up to about 70% because of the speed of need that was required there. And even when you're kind of talking about executing at the leading edge, I can link that now to what probably military leaders and business leaders are coping with: the cyber digital battlefield, digital transformation in our businesses. So how do you see your years of experience really across, coming back into the business world? How do you see leadership evolving as we've gone through these years? We're now in this transformational era, and speed really is the competitive currency of today.
Yeah, I think, what I see is kind of a full circle, because, humans are still at the heart of what we do. So whether it's, rewinding all the way back to laying down code to deploying a piece of software or technology on the battlefield, it ultimately comes back to people. Now, maybe the amount of people has changed potentially because of technology, but it's still truly the skills that sometimes we want to ignore, those soft skills, the way that we communicate, the way that we articulate our leaders' intent, who we include in the future-based planning or not, based on ego, based on the way the organization is set up. There's so many things, but it ultimately comes back to the way we communicate with people. I mean, the best leaders I've been around aren't pushing people out the door to go execute or into battle. They don't have to. The volunteer force wants to get into battle. They want to execute on behalf of the CEO. They're compelled along with the CEO into a future. They're not being pushed. And that's all about alignment. So for me, leadership is about helping to co-create the future the organization wants and lay down those principles, the ethos, the things we'll always do and never do. Not everybody can join our culture. And that's part of the leader, is to help develop that future and compel, inspire the organization to get there. That's the first step in alignment.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with that, actually. And when you particularly look at the challenges that many leaders are facing today, and new challenges just around the corner because of that pace of change, then it's it's a completely different landscape to what it was even sort of 15 years ago for many of them. And coming back to your experience of setting up Afterburner and the business ecosystem that you talked about setting up now as well, you've brought lessons from your background in the military as well as your lessons from business, and you're applying it to this current context, this that I'm talking about here. So what lessons have been learned from what you're seeing there, Jim, over the last sort of 15 years that leaders
Oh,
everywhere really need to sit up and take notice of?
if I could talk to leaders today, what I'm disappointed in right now is a word that nobody wants to talk about because maybe it's kind of considered too harsh right now. But it really still goes right back to the word discipline. And discipline's not about this hardcore accountability. We're going to do push-ups and pull-ups and we're going to yell at people. No, it's about transparency. And what disappoints me is there's very little transparency, which means there's very little discipline or accountability in the organization. And that's a two-way street. As a leader, you're accountable to your actions that align to the future that you co-developed with your team. And the team is responsible for the daily, weekly, monthly actions or activities to get there. But unless we're holding each other accountable through effective debriefing or execution rhythm meetings with transparency in a safe, psychologically safe environment, so everybody feels like they can freely admit errors in front of each other or successes without the fear of pushback, reprimand, etc. I mean, that's the biggest thing that's standing in the way today, I believe, in modern leadership is just this transparency, which drives accountability both ways, up and down. And the hidden word there is discipline, I believe.
Yeah, so that discipline, the transparency, that accountability hits home. Is very easy to get out of accountability in certainly some of the teams that I've been working with, and creating that psychological safe environment, not just for the rest of your organization, but for that leadership team as well. It really needs to open up, doesn't it? So if I take that as, if you like, some best practices from leaders today, can you give us any examples of organizations or leaders who are modeling that and what others can learn from them?
Yeah, I mean, we sell our own framework, Flawless Execution. And at the heart of what we do is we have a cycle of planning using 6 steps, brief the plan right before we execute by eliminating task saturation or task overload. And then as soon as the mission is over, have a nameless, rankless debrief. The only thing that leaves the debrief are lessons learned that get flown right back into the next day's plan, and we execute much better. So think about this feedback loop: plan, brief, execute, debrief, plan, brief, execute, debrief. You start to execute at the speed of change or even slightly ahead of it when you do it this way. Now, it's simple, straightforward, and it works. I mean, it absolutely works. I've seen it work for 27 years, but it is very hard for an enterprise to embrace it. Now, I work with mainly publicly traded enterprises. Some of the, like I said earlier, I've worked with CEOs we've all read about and want to aspire to be. And I've had some really frank conversations with some of these, and I'll share some of these conversations. So one particular organization, which was in the retail space, brought us in for an operational issue that they were having, and we were working with a very large part of one of their verticals. And we embedded this process, flawless execution, and they were getting massive results. So that enabled me to go have a meeting with the CEO. And I remember talking to the CEO about what we were doing and the data and the results, and he was very impressed. And then, of course, as a good consultant, I'm trying to upsell, and so we can do this across the enterprise. And I was getting a little bit of pushback, and I finally got a little frustrated. And I was quite a bit younger than the CEO at the time. And I finally just said, "Well, sir, I'm just not so sure that you have the courage to execute." And it was bold for me to make that statement, but I remember the CEO stopping and obviously asking the logical next question, "Well, Murph, what's the courage to execute?" And I just said, "Well, sir," I said, at the heart of what we do in flawless execution is transparency, nameless, rankless debriefing. And I go, "Now, sir, I understand in your position, you report to a board of directors, shareholders, there's a lot of things going on. But unless you role model nameless, rankless debriefing, unless you're able to do inside, outside criticism in front of the market, your shareholders, your employees, your team, this is going nowhere because it has to emanate from the top. So I have to get you in the top 3 echelons of rank in the organization to buy into this, because we can't expect this type of great execution rhythm down into the organization unless you yourselves role model it as well. So what I have found out is, having repeated that, 10 plus times in my career, looking at 7-figure plus consulting engagements, I think we've only closed about 20% of those. And I don't think it was because I wasn't doing a very good job selling. I think it was because most leaders in today's world, push back from that kind of transparency and just, you're right, Murph. I don't have the courage to execute, or they would never say that, but they were just saying, I'm not willing to bring that burden onto the senior leadership team. And that's great, because that's the type of organization we don't need to be wasting our time working with. And the best organizations that I worked with readily said, I have the courage to execute. Today, I'm going to do my first debrief in front of the enterprise. I'm going to boldly state that we're going to use this framework, this process by name, and it's going to emanate from the top. And when that happens, we get total alignment. And then you get an enterprise, an organization that's using a common mental model to execute day in and day out. Think about it, a very common mental model that's super simple: plan, brief, execute, debrief. And boy, this really moves the needle big time.
Yeah, I guess for some of those leaders who aren't making that move, is that the other side of the courage coin is vulnerability. And vulnerability at some of those levels where ego and pride get in the way isn't really an easy next step for some. Certainly some of those that I've met, I can tell you, I'm sure, Jim. But yeah. If I pick out that, because it resonates to me, the nameless, rankless debriefs, the ability to then execute at the speed of change that you're talking about, with everybody on board from the very top through, everybody kind of almost on a level doing this and looking at it at the same way. I can understand the rapidity, the ability to experiment quickly and learn from things that you were talking about before, and actually making progress. So what are the risks or even downsides for those leaders who are saying, yeah, Jim, you're right, I don't have the courage, so I'll just kind of keep going as we're going? Surely the stakes are high for them.
I would like to clarify one statement, because you make it sound like it's real simple. The whole organization will do this basic framework and we're all good. But that's just not the way big enterprises work. You got to realize that a large enterprise may be involved in 10, 12, 50 plus different business verticals or things. It's a very complex organization, right? It's a complex organism, if you will. So really, as a leader, what you want is to, no matter where in the organization someone's executing, they are aligned to the shared mental model of the future that you've embedded into the organization. So they can mold and adjust correctly based on their own environment within the enterprise or the marketplace. But we're all basically heading in the same quadrant. We're heading into the northeast direction versus every direction. And so in the military, we call that leader's intent. At Afterburner, we create what we call an HDD for the organization, a high definition destination. And that is putting as much details into the future of the organization once, maybe 3 years, 2 years, 4 years down the road, in as many different business buckets as possible. And we get as many people in the leadership team involved when we do that. The CEO always has 51% of the vote, but we encourage our CEOs to listen and let those other leaders help develop the future, because they all then have buy-in. But what really resonates is the arguments that happen along the way, because when we finally decide what we're going to do, there were so many people exposed to the whys and the pushbacks and, well, we're going to do this, and the negotiations, that we all start to align our thought processes. And now a large group of people start getting aligned on what this means. And if you think about how that then cascades throughout the organization, because now the organization is like a living organism with a shared consciousness to make decisions. And even though I made my decision over here because I'm isolated in another country, in another business vertical, I still understand where we're going. So I can freely use my own plan, brief, execute, debrief framework in the context of where I am today. but this execution rhythm has taken me here. It's connected, it's linked. And the best leaders in the best organizations understand that.
Yeah, that's a very important point, and I'm glad you clarified that in terms of what I'd said as well, because it's that cadence, isn't it? That rhythm of movement when you're trying to bring all of these moving parts together. Is sometimes you've got to slow down to speed up. We all know that, but some try and do everything all at once, and that's where it can fall down. So thanks for that clarification. And maybe I can, because you'll have seen this happen. So those leaders that aren't doing this right, what is happening in their organization in terms of the people, the mindset of the organization, and also with the leaders themselves?
Well, I think that they meet on a fairly regular basis to update the status of the progress into the future, meaning the HDD in our speak, the high definition destination. If you're not meeting on a regular basis on your progression to the future that you all agreed on, then there is no transparency or accountability. And it's so funny. I mean, we spend so much time measuring the past performance financially in spreadsheets. We look past all the time, but we rarely measure our progress to the most important thing. And that's how we're progressing to the future that we all said we want. And I think one of the main struggles that we have dealing with the publicly traded enterprises that we mainly work with globally is there's so much churn and turnover in the leadership ranks because of shareholder and what's happening in the market. That you see these organizations that turn over the C-suite on a regular basis. There's very little future-based planning because really they're executing into the next quarter's results, which a lot of times has really nothing to do with what the organization should be focused on, which is the longer view, the North Star, the V prop for the customers or clients, because those are changing, et cetera.
Yeah, that's it. That's right. In fact, I did a piece of research last year around transformational leadership, and what was interesting was that we're kind of pretty aware of some of the leaders who are failing or some of the organizations that have failed. But what came out of that survey was that it was just under 50% of capable leaders were so under pressure because they were taking on so much more load because there wasn't the broader capability in the organization, that they were saying that by the end of 2025, I'll be making a call whether to stay or go because it is just not sustainable for me right now as it is. Do you see that out there, Jim?
Yeah, one of the main things that we address at Afterburner is something called task saturation or task overload. And you can imagine as a single seat fighter pilot sitting in the nose of an F-15, 350 switches and dials, all kinds of technology, radios, communication. It's a lot for a single human to process and then go out and execute. And then, oh, by the way, we're moving across the ground 10 miles a minute. So, a lot's happening. And we realized early on that task saturation is something that is silently killing a lot of pilots. A lot of pilots are flying perfectly good jets into the ground because they're focused on the wrong things at the wrong time because they have the perception or the reality that they're too task saturated. Now, at Afterburner, we defined it and service marked this as a business term. So what is task saturation? Task saturation is the perception or the reality of having too much to do with not enough time, tools, or resources to getting the mission at hand accomplished. And we know as task saturation increases, errors increase and performance actually decreases. Yep, like you found and like you say, most organizations are going, no, we want more task saturation because we're more efficient if we let less people handle all of these tasks. So this is a real thing. And, this is a human factors condition as well. And unless your technology frameworks are aligned to the actual issues in the business, they even create more versus less task saturation.
Yeah, and that resonates as a term. It is that it's doing more with less was seen as a very positive within the organizations, but not executed particularly well, and pressuring your best resources to this point where they could focus on the wrong thing and make the wrong decisions quite easily. I kind of see that still happening day in, day out. So if I come out of this,
just to add on
sorry,
that,
Jim, yeah, go on.
Humans deal with task saturation in multiple ways, but one of them is to channelize. And that means focus all their attention on what they believe is the biggest issue or problem right now. So think about this. You're executing a lot of different KPIs or focused on a lot of things, but then there's this one problem and you get everybody to focus here and you fly a perfect good airplane into the ground, or you miss the critical customer or client outcome KPI because now we're focused on an internal KPI. So it's such a great point that you were moving towards.
Yeah, well, and that goes back to our point before about there's so many moving parts that any one of those can cause that fatal crash or halt in the system, whatever the system that is. So there's actually quite a lot to think about here. So for those leaders who are tuning in that say, right, I really need to start making some progress in these areas. I really like some of these concepts that Jim's been talking about here. What would be your 4 or 5 key messages for them to help them to get to action and accelerate their own or their organization's progress?
All right, I'm not going to necessarily go in order because I would start with the future. We talked about that a little bit. I'll come back to that. But since we're talking about task saturation, what are some things we can do to help our organizations if task saturation is preventing us from executing our future position? And, one of the things that comes to mind are SOPs, which is, old school. If you think about it, standard operating procedures. Yeah. What is a standard in an organization or an SOP? It's a minimum level of execution that you prescribe to a large group of people. So you don't have to retrain, recommunicate all of the time. You teach the standard one time and you hold everybody accountable to that standard. So you don't have to remake things, always come back to it over and over again. So standards are critical. And if you really look at the best organizations that scale, they do it because there is a minimum level of execution that they require their associates to have as they get onboarded and they come through their initial training. And they're already ready to go versus waiting a year for them to learn through the story of hard knocks how to get there. So that's one really big tool that helps eliminate task saturation. Now, for leaders, again, we're all future-based, right? So as a leader, if you're not getting your team together and you're not moving beyond next quarter's results or even next year and creating an HDD with many details. So what is an HD? It's a high definition destination that you and your senior leadership team, and I would go all the way down to the fielded commanders. So go beyond the EVPs, get down to the VP level. These are the folks that used to execute on the line that have been promoted because they have a different perspective of what's going on in the field, in that area of the world, or in that vertical versus what you may have up in the C-suite because they're out there doing it. You need that level of management in the room. And then you work together to come up with as much detail of what the finish line looks like in, let's say, 36 months. So what does the brand stand for on that day in 36 months? What markets are we in or not in? What do our employees look like? What are the financials at that point? As many buckets as you can. And then once you create that HDD, the motions of getting there are going to be revealing because now all of a sudden it's easy to discover what the critical leverage points or KPIs need to be now because now we're aligned. We understand clearly what the future looks like. And it's much easier now to make our first, second, and third order steps in business that are aligned to a predetermined future. And it may not be perfect. That's what debriefing is all about. We have to be agile. It's not a straight line to get there. So as leaders, a lot of times we feel like that's our role by ourselves behind closed doors. We have to be brilliant. But no, your team's got every answer that you need. And if not, they're one Google or stroke or one phone call away from getting the information you need anyway. So why not have the smartest people in the room help you develop the future? And those are the people on your team.
Yeah, that's many organizations taking that much more seriously now with things like reverse mentoring into the boards or the C-suites. And it's a great way of flattening that hierarchy and understanding actually something else that I also see is that the narrowing of the capability gap when we consider sort of the new world, new ways of working, all of those kind of things. So thanks very much for this. Go on, Jim.
Yeah, one more tip would be, task saturation in this chaotic workplace that we're in is tough in this complex world, right? So complexity. Simplicity beats complexity every time. If you want to go fast, it's about simplicity. So your business may be complex. Your value prop may be fairly complex, but the frameworks in your business need to be simple. So instead of having a complex framework for the tech team, which may be using some sort of agile methodology versus what the senior leadership team is using, a KPI type of methodology versus what maybe operations and manufacturing is using, I would, instead of going with multiple frameworks, try to get it down to one or a very small number so we can all get aligned on a common mental model to get our work done.
Yeah, go fast, keep it simple, keep it a few steps at a time. I get
Absolutely.
that completely. And Jim, I have to say thank you very much for being so open and sharing such a broad insights for those that are tuning in today. I'm sure many of those listening in will want to connect, continue the discussion with you and within your businesses. So how do they get in touch?
Yeah, they can get in touch with me through LinkedIn, James D. Murphy, or Flawless Execution. So James D. Murphy on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect with you. I also have a website, jamesdmurphy.com and afterburnercapital.com. So the best way, though, is LinkedIn, jamesdmurphy.com.
Great. Well, thank you, Jim Murphy, for joining me. It's been a real pleasure to have you.
Thank you. And happy hunting to your listeners. Have a great day.
Thanks for tuning in to the Rethink Leadership podcast with me, Jeremy Blaine. Please like, comment, and support us on your favorite platform and subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can watch as well as listen to each episode.